And so we've talked about a lot about direct and indirect expenses, and then let's talk about identifying and allocating these indirect expenses to departments. So we talked about direct and indirect expenses to quite a large extent now. Make sure we have it memorized. I think we all do. Direct expenses are costs traced directly to a department. Indirect are costs that are incurred for a joint benefit. So this is similar definition to direct materials, direct labor, but here we're saying it in the context of a department. So if a department knows they're incurring a direct expense, a certain expense for their department, a good example is like a department manager. He is responsible for the department. He is a direct expense to that department. An indirect expense, maybe there's someone who works in multiple departments, or maybe there's a shared rent, a few departments operating in one building. So we'd have to determine how we allocate a portion of these indirect expenses to each department. And so a good example here are wages and salaries relative to the amount of hours. So if I worked in two departments, maybe split my salary 50-50 between two departments. Maybe rent, we allocate based on square feet. Utilities, maybe square feet. Advertising, percentage of sales. Depreciation, hours of depreciable asset used. These are just examples, but I want this to tie into your bigger judgment and understanding as a college student that you can allocate in any way that's reasonable, and this will be open to discussion between your managers. So if I'm running a department, I'll tell the other department head that I think it might be fair that we do everything by square footage, but they might believe we do it by depreciate at a different base, and we'd have to work that out. And the reason is because we want to see if our department itself is profitable when compared to other departments. And we want to control the costs in our department. So each department will have its own P&L. We call that P&L, but that's an income statement or a contribution margin statement. They'll all have their own statements that funnel up to the larger company statements. So some different ways to allocate. Main thing we're trying to do here is cause and effect relationships. The best way to allocate is to do a statistical model. We've talked about this before too. These correlation models are too. But a lot of the time we don't have the systems around that. So really we just want to look if there's some kind of causation and correlation related to a cost, so some kind of cause-effect relationship, then we'll build that into allocating the expense. So the allocated cost is equal to the total cost to allocate multiplied by the percentage of allocation base used. So example here, allocated cost, well, let's say rent is 1,000 and then 50% of the square footage is used for my department. So $500 would be used for my department or allocated to my department. How do we do indirect expenses? We just talked about this. Just memorize the different types of allocation bases here. This is more qualitative. Wages and salaries relative to the hours worked. We talked about the top parts, maybe service department, office expense, number of employees or sales in each department, personnel expense. Maybe we could talk about the number of employees in each department. Maintenance expense, the square feet of the floor that the space is used. So here's an illustration. Let's just go through this example. Classic Jewelry pays its janitorial services $800 a month to clean its stores. Management allocates the cost of 3 departments according to the floor space it occupies. So we have 3 departments in the store: jewelry, watch repair, and china and silver. And we want to see which one's more profitable, which one costs more. So we allocate the costs based off of the percentage of square feet. We take the percentage of square feet by doing jewelry. It has 60%. They're saying they have 2,400 square feet over the 4,000. We get the 15% of watch repair by the 600 divided by the 4,000, and the 25% for the china and silver by the 1,000 divided by the 4,000. And we multiply these allocations based on the department's square feet and the total cost. So the 60% times the 800, we get the 480. The 15% times the 800, we get the 120, and the 25% times the 800, we get the 200. And the total allocable base always ties and agrees to the total amount per month. And so then we have a fair indirect cost allocation based on department. Not too hard now that we understand allocation. I think I told you in your first managerial accounting class with me. What is managerial accounting? It's really just 2 things: estimating into the future and then allocating. And we're going to talk about tons of different ways to estimate and allocate. And that's what we've been doing, and that's what we continue to do. So as long as you've been practicing those skills, I think this should make a lot of sense. prepare departmental income statements and contribution reports. Again, just cumulative. We did the contribution margins for a whole company, now we're just going to do it for a department. The only difference here is that we have to allocate those indirect pieces, make sure that we are allocating correctly to the departments, to the right department. So income statement. So we have to do the same thing, revenues and expenses. Only difference here, it's by department. Allocate the indirect expenses, allocating service department expenses, and then we prepare the income statement. So it's the exact same as everything else we've done so far. The only thing different is now we have these departmental shared expenses that we have to figure out. And so here's a good example of how we'd see a spreadsheet or a Google sheet. We'd see the sales by department. We have our service departments and our operating departments. Service departments, what are these? These are cost centers, right? We have two different centers. These are cost centers. These are our profit centers. Purchasing and general office aren't making us money. They're helping run the day-to-day of the operating centers, right? So we don't expect sales to be incurred in a profit center. In a cost center, we expect it in an operating center. Goal of these departments as a cost center is to what? To control costs, to bring costs down for these operating centers to make more money and to help these run efficiently. So general office, service departments, 13,300 salaries, depreciation, supplies. That makes sense. There's not going to be any cost of goods sold because they're not selling anything. Same thing with the purchasing department, which is responsible for getting the best deal they can for the rest of the operating departments. Hardware, housewares, and appliances. We have our sales, our cost of goods sold, our salaries, and all of this. All of these are direct expenses. We know exactly what we're applying because they're exactly related. But then we need to go figure out these indirect expenses. How are we going to apply them? We're going to apply them based on what we just talked about, right? We talked about methods of what? Allocation. Managerial accounting is all about allocation. So here, how are they doing it? We're saying, first off, because the general office department is a service department, they were saying we need to allocate some of this to all and some of the purchasing department to the profit centers because these really don't make any profit. So it makes sense that sometimes we have to allocate our service or our cost centers to our profit centers to make sure that they are accurately representing profit. As an accounting team, you are never going to make a profit for a company unless it's an accounting company that sells accounting services. So we need to allocate some of those costs to the profit centers to see if they are still profitable after we allocate those costs. And so what we've done here is we've taken the total amount and we've allocated to each one of these based off of a certain allocation model. So using a general model, A1 allocates indirect costs. We show that the department, so that's going to be in a later exhibit, but the idea here, we're not going to worry about the calculations, is that we're allocating some of the service department to our hardware, housewares, and alliance department, and some of the purchasing department to all of these profit centers. And then we also allocate some of these indirect expenses based off of the amount of value of space, floor space sales, and value of insured assets. And ultimately, we can make the departmental income statements for the profit centers, right? We won't have an income statement for the cost center because the cost center, in theory, is supporting these profit centers. So we have our direct expenses, our allocated indirect expenses, and then we allocated the service costs because the service costs or service centers or cost centers are shared costs between the profit centers. And then we have to figure out our departmental contribution to overhead. So we generally say departmental revenue minus direct expenses is equal to our departmental contribution to overhead. So memorize this formula. This is a formula for departmental contribution to overhead. It's used to evaluate department's performance, and it is not a function of arbitrary allocations or indirect expenses. We're just looking at department revenue minus direct expenses equals our department overhead. This is similar to contribution margin, right? We're just looking at department revenue kind of against their direct expenses. So we're not going to look at any of those shared expenses, and we're going to see how that department's doing by itself. And so here, if we want to look at department contribution overhead, we take away all the indirect expenses, and we take away all the service components, and we just find out how much money they're making directly. And we're saying that for each one of these, they make a direct amount that they compare, that they contribute to all of these indirect expenses. That's it. So there's just different ways we can assess it, each department.